Hi, I'm Andy Scree, and today we're going to talk about how to operationalize advanced analytics. We're going to go over some of the basic features and functions that exist in the analytics outside of just anomaly detection, like how does Exabeam Analytics help you with host-to-IP mapping? How does Exabeam Advanced Analytics help you identify asset ownership? We'll talk to you a little bit about how to threat hunt. After we've handled all of the notable users that Exabeam's generated, we're going to have time to do some predictive threat hunting or proactive threat hunting to identify those threats to the environment that we didn't know we needed to look at before. So what we're going to look at first and foremost is technology that Exabeam Analytics has that we call host-to-IP mapping. Now, what essentially is happening here is we're mapping a host to an IP at any given time in the environment. Now, you might say that my DHCP logs do that for me, and that's 100% true. So what analytics does, we actually take it a step further, and we start to learn not just what host has what IP, but also what user has presence on that host when it has that IP. So when you think about it, we're essentially saying A equals B, host to IP, B equals C, user to host. Then we can go ahead and correlate A equals C, which means that we can actually assign a user to an IP address on the fly at any given time. This is something that's a challenge to most organizations. Just figuring out host to IP can be a challenge in going through the DHCP logs. So let's start to look at how Exabeam can help us understand what host had what IP, and more importantly, what happened on that host when it had that IP address. So what we can start with is we can actually just search for an IP address in the search bar. So I went ahead and just typed in a full IP address, and I'm going to immediately see the host that had it last, and I'll get a status on whether or not this is a risky host or not in my environment. And then I'll also see assets associated with this IP. So I'm going to see all of the IP assignments. And I'm going to go ahead and hit View All IP Assignments. And I get this table. This is going to tell me the host that had that IP and the least duration when it had that particular IP. So now I can see this really quickly and easily, all the different hosts that were assigned this IP. And in this case, it's one single host. But in a more rich DHCP environment, you're going to see multiple hosts having this IP at different times and places. The other thing you might see is actually top user may be listed. When there's an asset in the environment that we have assigned an ownership to based on authentication patterns, we'll also tell you which user owns that particular asset that was assigned that IP address. So once I know which host had what IP, now my next step is to figure out what happened on that host at that given time. And that's where we could go ahead and actually hit View Sessions. And we'd be able to jump into a threat hunter search and a timeline of everything that happened to that host and that user on that IP. We're actually going to get to that a little bit later when we talk about threat hunting, but just being able to search for one IP address and find all of the hosts associated to it within a couple clicks is very powerful, because these are things that security analysts are doing multiple times a day through DHCP logs, and it's not always an easy process. Now, on the flip side, what we can do is we can actually search for a host within Exabeam and find all of the IPs that that host was assigned. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to actually take a host name. So I've searched for a particular host in the environment, and I can see the latest IP that it was assigned. And then again, I can pop this down and see all IP associations for this particular host. So I can see all of the different IPs that this host was assigned. And once again, this looks very static for this particular workstation. But you can see how we can come at it from either angle and find the inverse of what we're looking for. And this is Exabeam's host-to-IP mapping. And this is going to save your security analysts a ton of time, because again, they're doing this multiple times a day. Now, one of the other challenges that most organizations have outside of identifying what host had what IP at any given time or what user was on what host is understanding who owns a host in a particular environment. Now, most organizations have a CMDB or some sort of asset database, but it's not always kept up to date. So this was a challenge that I ran into many a times at eBay. We'd get an alert out of some SIM, and we'd have to figure out, okay, well, what is this host, who owns it, and what is it being used for in my environment? And it was a challenge because we usually didn't have that information. When we look at Exabeam's Advanced Analytics, I'm going to drill all the way into a timeline here. I'm going to scroll up. I can click on any host in the environment. So I see Barbara started her session with a Kerberos login to this particular asset. I can click on that asset, and I can see things like the top user of that asset. In an Exabeam, the top user of an asset is essentially the owner. This is the user who logs into it the most. So in this case, we're assigning ownership of this asset to Barbara. Now, if I want to know how does Barbara relate to all other users who have logged into it, I can click on it here, and I can see the histogram we've built. And I can see clearly Barbara logs into this asset the most, therefore she's the owner. Now this pays huge dividends when we talk about things like executive assets. How do I know which assets my executive owns? Again, that's hard to keep those lists up to date, and you may want to build logic and correlation rules to look for users accessing executives' assets. It's very hard to do that with correlation because those assets are always changed, that list becomes stale. So Exabeam is going to dynamically assign ownership of assets to your executives, to even database administrators or other administrators if you go ahead and label those particular users. Now, one of the other challenges that we face as incident responders is trying to identify normal. So again, we get an alert for something. Let's say it's Barbara decides to RDP into a system. And now we need to figure out, well, has Barbara ever RDP'd before? Has she RDP'd into this system? What does normal look like for Barbara? So if we don't want to look at her timeline or look at specific anomalies, we can always look at Barbara's data insights. I'm going to pivot over into Barbara's more insights here. And what we're showing you is all of the data models we've built for this particular user. So this gives you this rich background and history of what normal looks like for any user on the network. This is way easier than trying to gather this information by running long historical searches in a SIM. So again, I get an alert, and the first thing I need to know is, has this happened before and is it normal? I can come into my data insights and get answers to questions very quickly. Like I can look at all of the assets Barbara's ever remotely accessed across my environment. If I didn't have this data model today, I'm most likely going to run a search in my SIM and say, show me all of the assets and count how many times Barbara's accessed each of these assets over the last 30 or 60 days. Now that query might take hours to return in some cases. It may take minutes, but it's still not enough information for the security analyst. I want to be able to see all of the assets Barbara's remotely accessed, maybe all of the logins she has, what is the workstation she typically logs into. This is a lot of rich information to gather background about a user before you even start your investigation and start to dive deep into either the sessions or the raw log data. I can get information about the countries that she VPNs in from, the source IP addresses, and even the endpoints that she utilizes. So this is a great place to start an investigation if you don't necessarily know where to start. Come into the data insights and start to understand the behavior of the user and what normal looks like for the particular user. So once we know how to find IPs and hosts and understand the mapping, and once we know where to find asset ownership and how to understand normal, we may say, well, okay, we can figure out we may figure out that we can start to triage and handle alerts coming out of the SIM and other solutions very quickly, leveraging Exabeam to identify hosts or IPs, asset ownership, and understand normal. And we may have handled all of the notable users that exist in the notable users list for the day. So now it might be up to my security analyst to start to be a little bit more proactive and start to leverage some threat hunting capabilities. So now we're going to talk about how do we leverage Exabeam's threat hunter and how does this differentiate itself from a standard SIM search. So in order to get to threat hunter, I can go ahead and use the drop-down arrow here. So now I get this rich availability of drop-downs and pre-configured text menus to start to query and hunt through my data. Now, the way that Exabeam differs from your standard SIM search is we have this session data model, right? We know when the user's active, we know when their session started, when it ended. And because of this underlying session, we're able to ask multi-dimensional questions of threat hunter that we just can't do with a SIM today, or at least not easily with a SIM. So the way I like to demonstrate this is, let's say I want to find any user across my environment who is a non-executive user accessing an executive's asset, all while connected on the VPN from China. So it seems like a pretty simple, straightforward question I could ask my SIM today. But when you break it down, you realize it's not. Right? So if I'm going to do this in my SIM, I'm probably going to start by finding and searching for all users who connected on the VPN from China. Let's say I do this across a week. I'm going to get a list of users. I'm going to go ahead and write those users down in a notepad or copy and paste it somewhere. Then I'm going to take each user and I'm going to search each user individually against my VPN logs again. And I'm going to figure out when did the VPN session start and when did it end. So now I'm going to write the time frame next to the username so I know when it started and ended. So I'm running multiple searches across each user to find those time frames. Now I have a list of users and time frames when they're on the VPN. Now I need to take each user and each time frame and search my Windows event logs to find out, did they access an executive's asset? Furthermore, I need to first know who are my executives and what are their assets. In most cases, most organizations don't have that level of context in their SIM today, and that's where it breaks down. But even if I do this, you can see that this is a multi-step approach. It's going to take my security analyst a lot of time to look through a week's worth of data to find out, did this happen? With Exabeam's advanced analytics and Threat Hunter, you simply only have to add a couple of different criteria here in Threat Hunter to be able to get the value and get the answers to this search. So first I'm going to start by looking at geolocation from China. And I'm also going to filter by reasons. And the reasons here, this is a full list of all of the anomaly detections and rules that we have out of the box. So I can just start to type in the word first, and I get all of the anomaly detections that include the word first. So you can start to see and play around with the different anomalies that Exabeam can generate. What I want to look at, though, is access to an executive asset. So I'm going to say a non-executive user logging into an executive's asset. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit search. So Exabeam's done this search, and you can see even the time frame from 7/17 to 9/29. It's a pretty broad time range for these results to be returned so quickly. But I can see I have one user that meets this criteria, and is Rob Koch. Now, one of the other things that's important about Threat Hunter, unlike a SIM, is in a SIM, when you run a search, you get the events that you ask for, just those events. Within Exabeam, you get the session. So not only am I going to get the VPN login from China and the access to the executive asset, I'm going to get everything else that happened around it. Right? These may help answer questions I didn't even know I needed to ask. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump right into a session timeline. And I can see that Rob goes ahead and he VPNs in from China. And I have some anomalies related to this particular activity. So he's connecting from a known anonymous proxy. And it's also the first time we've ever seen him connect from this IP address before. And then we scroll down a little bit further, and at 2:48 a.m. we see a remote logon. Now this is a remote interactive login type 10, to this particular host. And this is where Exabeam's calling out the fact that Rob is a non-executive accessing an executive's asset. Well, here Exabeam's not telling me anything about who owns this asset quite yet. What we can do is we can click on the asset itself, and we can see the top user is Philippe Pennington. If I go ahead and drill in on Philippe, I can see that he's actually our VP of Information Security. So I have Rob Koch VPNing in from China on an anonymous proxy IP address, RDPing to my VP of Information Security's laptop. Right? You can see how quickly and easily Exabeam can, one, craft the right search to identify this activity, give you the full audit trail of everything Rob did, not just the VPN login or the access to the executive's asset. There were some other activities in there that we could investigate. And then we can also pivot from the asset itself to identify the owner and figure out who he is and the fact that he is a VP within the organization. Now, that was a very specific threat hunting search. So we can be very specific in adding specific risk reasons and anomalies that we want to look for. We can also start very broad and look at various activity types. So one of the riskier activity types to an organization is any user who VPNs in. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. I'm going to say I want to see any VPN login activity. Now, I could also add additional parameters into my threat hunter search, like activity status, whether or not the session was accepted. I could look at specific vendors of security alerts, like maybe I want to know any user who VPN'd in and had a Cisco Firepower alert. I could look at specific alert IDs, which are unique identifiers for each malware alert. We could put in additional usernames, user labels, so things like my privileged accounts or my service accounts I could start to filter my search on. We can look at peer groups, assets and asset labels. We already talked about the risk reasons. These are the anomalies. We could filter out based on specific risk scores, geolocations, and also network subnets. So maybe I want to just search my logs to find, hey, did I have anyone VPN into my organization and also access my PCI network? Maybe I don't want that to happen, or it shouldn't happen based on configs I put in, and I just want to validate that that's actually happening or not happening. But here we're going to start very broad and just search for any user who's VPN'd into the organization. And we get a list of over 6,200 results returned, all of these VPN logins. And my threat hunter results, again, these are the entire sessions, and they're sorted by the riskiest sessions at the top. I could go ahead and sort by different parameters, whether I want to look at just the user or time frames. But what I want to do is I want to look at some of the filters now we have on the results on the left-hand side, where I could filter on users or assets, network zones, peer groups, additional account names. But where I typically go first are other event types. And what I want to do is I want to look at what else happened on the network for these users while they were connected remotely on the VPN. So obviously I'm going to see things like VPN logins and logouts, my standard Windows authentication activities. What I normally do is scroll to the bottom, and I want to find the things that are more unique happening on my VPN. And one of them that stands out to me here is account creation. So I may not want account creation happening on the VPN. I may want my domain admins and my administrators to create accounts only when they're in the office. It's less risky to my business. So I'm going to go ahead and drill into the account creation. So now what Exabeam's showing me from a threat hunter perspective is one user who was VPN'd into the organization and created an account. So now we can go ahead and drill into this particular session. And I see it's Delmar Erickson here. He's a computer scientist. He VPN'd in from the US. You'll see no anomalies detected here or risk points added, which means the VPN login is completely normal, especially from this geolocation for Delmar. We scroll down and we see this creation activity. Right? And I can go ahead and expand this, and we can see which account he actually created. Well, as a security analyst, I'm a little curious as to why I only have one user doing account creation on the VPN, and I may want to follow up and figure out, well, what did he do once he created this account, or what did this account do? This may be that Delmar has actually been compromised, and the attacker's logging in on the VPN in the US where Delmar normally logs in, but this attacker is now leveraging Delmar's credentials to create new credentials so the attacker can hide under these newly created credentials. So I'm going to go ahead and take this new created credential here, and I'm going to search it. And I'm not even going to use Threat Hunter. I'm just going to use the standard search bar. I'm going to paste that in. And before I hit search, what we can see is this session happened on Wednesday at Wednesday 9/27 at 8:10 a.m. That's when it started. And the account creation happened at 12:55 p.m. on the 27th. I go ahead and I look at this newly created credential. And I can see here that I have a session for this credential that started on 9/27 at 3:36 p.m. So it was created at 12:55. A few hours later, now I see it being leveraged and logging into my environment. And it even has an elevated risk score, right? So in Exabeam, not only do we add risk to abnormal activities when we have a historical baseline of normal, but sometimes it's the absence of normal that is what's of concern to a security analyst. So in this case, it may be that I have a user that I've never seen log into the environment, and it's logging into critical systems like domain controllers or PCI servers. So sometimes it's the absence of normal that can actually generate risk to a particular credential. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill into this credential, and we can see that the first thing this credential does after it's been created by Delmar or someone using Delmar's account is actually RDP into what looks like one of my domain controllers, ADDC. And here we're adding that we're adding risk here of 55 points because I have a remote login for a brand new user to my domain controller. And here I can see everything else that happened. Right? So when you think about how long it would take you in your traditional SIM environment to identify that this user credential may be suspicious or malicious, and go back and figure out everything it's done in the environment, all the assets that it's accessed, all the activity that it's performed, that's a daunting task. If you catch it early, in this case, maybe it's only been a day or two, it's not so bad. But if this activity happened 6 months ago and I need to go back and I need to run searches over the last 6 months to figure out everything this newly created credential has done in my environment, that's going to be a major challenge. This is where the data insights and all the data models which I had shown you for Barbara can start to come into play. I can start to understand what are all of the assets this newly created credential that may be malicious accessed. Did it ever VPN in and from where? Did this newly created service apps admin credential create additional credentials across the environment? This is the ability for Exabeam to take a threat hunter search and really search and pivot to find out what happened and follow the breadcrumbs. The idea here behind Exabeam and Threat Hunter and the timeline is that we should be able to answer the questions your security analyst is going to have next within a couple of clicks or a couple of seconds without having to go back and rerun new queries and constantly kind of get to dead ends and have more questions than answers. So this was kind of a quick overview of how to leverage Exabeam's advanced analytics from an incident response perspective, not only to kind of tackle some of the low-hanging fruit around the challenges that incident responders have day to day in finding hosts and IPs and asset ownerships and understanding normal, but also then to take it a next step further and start to do proactive threat hunting and identify things in the environment that shouldn't be happening that are, identify configuration problems, or help scope a breach. When I see a user VPNing in from China for the first time, I want to look at any other users who have done that. And Exabeam's going to be able to tell you all those users who have VPN'd in from China and then everything that happened after they VPN'd in from China. So thank you very much for watching How to Operationalize Advanced Analytics.